All right, now that we've introduced methods as well as parameters and arguments, which are the options that we supply to those parameters, we're ready to dive into the read CSV method. That will import our CSV files for us into the notebook so we can use them as our data sources. So let's begin by getting our pandas library, which is PD, and then use dot. So read CSV is called directly on the pandas library, and I'll press tab completion to see all of my available methods here, and just start typing the word read. And as we see here, the read CSV is just one of many different read methods that allows us to import different file types. So in addition to CSVs, we can import Excel files, HTML files, JSON, which is JavaScript object notation, SQL files, even things like the clipboard, which is what's stored in memory whenever you copy content from a web page. So there's a lot of different ways that we can bring data into pandas. In this example, we're going to want to select read CSV because our file is a read CSV file. Click enter to lock it into place, and our methods, all methods, require a set of parentheses at the very end. Within those parentheses, let's click into there, hold shift and press tab, and we can see the preview of the documentation. If you keep holding shift and pressing tab, you can get the documentation to show up at the bottom of the screen undisturbed. Now, in the last lesson, we dived into the pd.series method, which took something like 6 parameters. You can see the read CSV method is a lot more complex. It looks like it has dozens of different available parameters. There's many different ways that we can specify how the reading of the CSV will occur. But the very first parameter at the very top here is file path or buffer. And that makes sense because the very first thing that Pandas needs to know is the name of the file that we need to import and its location. Now, luckily for us, all of our CSV files are stored in the exact same folder as this Jupyter Notebook, so all we have to do is enter the file name in double quotes, and that file name does have to include the .csv extension. So inside these parentheses, I'm going to just write a pair of double quotes, and the file that we're going to use here is called pokemon.csv. So I can even start typing just the first couple letters and use tab completion at this point, and Jupyter Notebook is going to look within the folder, see that there's only one file that starts with Poke, and fill in the blanks and give us the file name with the .csv. So tab completion can be a savior in many different operations. Now, normally, just like with series, what we have to do is assign this result to a variable in order to be able to call things like attributes and methods on the object. But before I assign it to a variable, I just want to preview it to make sure that it looks exactly how we want it to. So I'm going to execute this as is. And what we're actually going to get here is not a series, but a data frame. A data frame is the next object that we'll dive into in the next module, and it's basically like a table with multiple rows and multiple columns. That's in comparison to a series, which is only one column, one dimension. Now, what we want to do really here is only import for this lesson the Pokemon column. So we want to leave out the type column that's on the right. So I can use a parameter here, and since it's going to be out of order, I'm going to have to write the parameter name explicitly. The parameter is called useCalls, and that's short for use columns, and that's basically telling Pandas to only use the columns that you provide. So the parameter requires an equal sign, and then we give it the argument. And the argument for this parameter has to be a list, so I'm going to do the Python brackets, and then within the list I'm going to write the names of the columns that I want to include or to use. So in this case, I'm going to just write Pokemon to make sure we only take in the Pokemon column instead of the type column as well. So let's re-execute this to see the result, and we'll see we run into yet another issue. So now we've successfully imported only the Pokemon column, but Pandas by default is going to import any CSV file as a data frame, even if it's only using one column. That's just its default behavior. So we have to use another parameter here in order to tell Pandas to import this single column as a series object instead of a data frame object. And that parameter is called squeeze. So I'm going to write squeeze after another comma, give it an equal, and squeeze accepts a Boolean argument, so either true or false. I'm going to give it true, which is going to convert it to a Pandas series, and we'll be able to tell that immediately by the visual look. So now if I execute this, we can see that we now have a Pandas series. That familiar look is what prompts us. Now, just as a heads up, the index to the left that we see here is automatically generated, so that's not part of our CSV file. Now we can specify a column from the CSV file to use as the index within the read CSV method, but we'll dive into that in a later lesson. For now, just realize that this has been automatically generated, and all Pandas has imported directly from the Pokemon file is the Pokemon column, which is just a bunch of strings. So now that it looks good to me, I'm going to assign it to a variable called Pokemon. That's going to store our series, and I'm also going to preview it immediately below, so we have to actually see something below the cell. So let's scroll down and take a look at this result. We can see that it's a bunch of strings, and this is probably the longest series that we've worked with so far. In fact, it's so long that Pandas is going to perform a truncation operation. That means it's going to cut out the middle section so not to overload the screen and make the Jupyter Notebook crash. And the default Pandas settings is to show 30 rows at the top and then 30 rows from the bottom. So that's why when we scroll down after row 29, and remember that's the 30th row because the index starts at 0, after that row it's going to place this ellipses symbol, which indicates that there's a gap in the data, and then it's going to pick up at the bottom and give us the last 30 rows of this series. And after we scroll down, we can see that our D type is still present. It says object, which is again internal lingo for a string. And we have a new thing appear here, which is the name of the series, and that's coming from the column header within our CSV file. So our very first row within the CSV file actually says Pokemon, so that's what it's used as the name of the series. So it can start importing just the values that start occurring in the CSV file at row 2 and proceed all the way to the end. So that's just one example of the read CSV method. I'm also going to demonstrate another example because we're going to be working with two different CSV files throughout these modules. One is Pokemon, which is strings, and the other one is going to be Google stock prices, which is going to be a series of floating point values. So let's just re-execute the read CSV method below, and that'll give us more practice. Once again, I'm going to do pd.read_CSV. I have to open those parentheses because it's a method, and within double quotes my very first parameter is going to be the file name. Now if I just type Google and press tab and I'm in the same folder that all my files are, it's automatically going to complete it for me, and our CSV here is called Google stock price. Now you'll see when I import this, here we only have one column and it's called stock price, so we don't need to use that useCalls parameter, but we still need to use that squeeze parameter and set it equal to true so that Pandas imports this as a series instead of a data frame. So there we have our familiar series. I don't want to call it ugly, but let's just say it's a little bit less aesthetically pleasing than a data frame. That's how we know it's a series. I'm satisfied with this result, so I'm going to assign it to a variable called Google. And once again, just preview Google below. This one is also quite long. I believe it's something like 3,000 rows. So you'll see as I scroll down after the first 30 rows, Pandas is once again going to show us those ellipses. That means there's a gap in the middle of that data set. And then afterwards, it's going to show us the last 30 rows. So we're going all the way up to 3011, which means there's 3012 total rows within this series from that file. Again, our D type is listed here. It's a floating point values within this series. And to the left, we have the name, which again is the column header that appears on top of this column within our actual original CSV file. So that's just the read CSV method. As you can see, it's used to import a CSV file directly within the notebook. In order to preserve that operation so that we can work with these series afterwards, we'll have to store that to a variable. So we use the Pokemon and Google variables in this lesson. And finally, we introduced two additional parameters that are available on the read CSV method. One of them is useCalls, which takes a Python list of the column names that we want to use, so the string names of the columns that we want to import. And finally, we introduced the squeeze parameter, which, when set to true, imports the CSV files column as a series object instead of as a data frame. So that's just an introduction to the read CSV method. And as a heads up, since we want each lesson to be self-contained, I'm going to be taking the code from the read CSV stuff, so this line right here, as well as the above code right here, and I'm going to be re-executing it at the beginning of each subsequent lesson, and that will ensure that we're always on the same page whenever we begin. So if you're continuing these lessons sequentially and you're not taking a break, you may be just fine continuing normally, but if you're coming back from a break or you just want to follow along, all you have to do is copy this code and just place it in the cell below and re-execute it, and we'll be starting at the exact same point, because I don't want to be modifying series and then having you pick up when I'm in a different position. And whenever we read read a CSV file, we're always going to take the data set in its default format, so it's not going to be modified. So we're always going to start from the same point at the start of each lesson. So that's just a big heads up. And in the next lesson, we'll start introducing some additional methods that are available upon our Pandas series objects.